reason there is a Webpack 5, and it's currently in beta. So Module Federation, oh man, it's not working. Let's see. There we go. Module Federation is about dependencies and tight coupling, and it's completely separate from React. So yes, it works with React, but it is not itself a technology that's like specific to React. And it's also made by Jack Harrington and Zach Jackson. You'll hear Zach's name come up multiple times because I actually talked to him in person. Well, not in person, it was online. But this Jack guy, he is the guy that made Webpack. So they work together to build Module Federation. So I'm Kevin Ghadyani. I've had 10 plus years of web development, and I've been working with React and Webpack for 5 years. So I've been in this for a while. And Module Federation, in my opinion, is the next big thing. It's going to vastly improve the maintainability of your applications. It's going to make it so you worry less. Oh, can you hear me? Oh, okay. Okay, so it's going to make it so you worry less about mismatched dependencies. And while I'd like to explain more about that, first we're going to talk about something else. So anybody used global.js? And what I mean by this is the script tags from the old days, which were maybe like a few years ago for some people. So if you look at this, we have like a script tag here importing jQuery from a CDN. And our code runs, and it looks for this $sign. This $sign is being created by this library. So this code in jQuery is assigning the jQuery code to $sign, and then it's on global. And so then our code has access to it, and we can do jQuery stuff. So that's a happy path. But what happens if we upgrade jQuery, or like some other third-party library brings in its own jQuery, or it maybe needs a different version of jQuery? Maybe we can't use that library now because it doesn't match our version, right? So this is how we, in the past, like, how do you solve this kind of issue that comes up? So if you end up having it like this, you end up getting something like this, where you import version 1 of jQuery, and then somehow version 3 gets imported, and then what ends up happening is version 3 overrides version 1, and your code breaks because it's thinking we have version 1 and we get in version 3. And that's because both of these libraries are mutating this $sign on the global scope. And so that's where our problems are coming from. So what we want is something maybe like this. I kind of made this up, but it's based on an actual code. So like basically, instead of $sign, it's adding it to a libraries object with with the version and the name of the package both in there. And so what this benefits us is now you can have two libraries coexisting. And then when you do an import, or when you define what the $sign is, you can tell it where it's come from. So other than this, the code is all the same, right? There's nothing any different except for this doesn't exist. You can't actually do this because these libraries will still mutate $sign. So there's no way around it right now. And most of you guys use NPM. So if you're using NPM, how does NPM actually solve this issue? And NPM solves it, well, let's look at the happy path. You would import jQuery, right? And then you just import it in your code this way. This is how you would do it with package.json and NPM today. But what if you need two versions of jQuery, right? You can't have two versions of jQuery in your app. You can't do this like upgrade over time. Maybe some other team needs a dependency, and that dependency requires jQuery 3. Well, now you got a big problem, right? How do you solve this problem? So there is actually a way to solve it with NPM. It's one way to solve it, but it is to rename these dependencies and then use this weird looking syntax here to actually get them to import two versions of the same thing into one NPM. So this is a way to potentially solve that issue. But I mean, there are some questions that would come up, right? If something's looking for a pure dependency of jQuery and you've got a dependency called jQuery 1, is it going to be able to find it? I don't think so. So how this plays in with other things is not really, it's not something I'm personally sure about because I haven't done too much experimentation with it, but I am using this now at work. And this is just something to keep in mind, like, okay, so this is one way to solve it, right? But there's another way to solve it too. So how do we really solve this issue of all these dependencies and having like different applications needing different things and trying to get everything to work together? Well, that's Module Federation. And it's two somewhat related topics. I know I brought up a couple other topics before, but it's really dependency mitigation and bundle size mitigation, which come from code splitting and micro frontends. So code splitting is not itself part of Module Federation. It can be used with Module Federation. And code splitting is where you basically create separate bundle chunks based on the code that you have. So you can create you can create like let's say you have two routes on your site. You have an about page and you have a home page. You can basically create one bundle for the home page and one bundle for the about page, and maybe they have different requirements of dependencies, and so you can split those out into two bundles, and then you have like one bundle which is kind of like basically dictating which one ends up loading at what time. So that's what code splitting is. That already exists today, but Module Federation takes it another step further because it's one of the topics of Module Federation is micro frontends. So now we're on to the second presentation here. It's what the heck is right? Like what the heck are micro frontends? So these are about tight coupling, or removing tight coupling, I should say, between your front end components and separating your dependencies. And it's the same concept as microservices. So if you're familiar with microservices, micro front ends are the same kind of concept as that. You're basically creating small little pieces of code to run that have like a very targeted, they have a targeted subject matter that they're like trying to go for, and then basically you're deploying them separately. So the real question is why you want a micro front end. Versus, everybody probably knows why you want microservices, but you don't necessarily know why you want a micro front end. So I'll give you an example of what we have today where I work, as we have an application that's got 100 other applications in it. So it's basically like a repository of 100 applications, and it's not a monorepo. So you might be familiar with the concept of a monorepo where you have multiple projects in there, but each of those projects would have its own package JSON. It would have its own dependencies. In this particular project, everything shares the same package JSON. So if somebody wants to upgrade React, 100 other applications need that upgrade as well because of how it's set up in the project. They're sharing the same Redux store, utility functions, ESLint, and testing rules. And if one team's test breaks, like you maybe change something or you upgrade a dependency and some other team's test breaks, well, now what do? Right? You got to go fix their code, or you got to get them to fix it. So this is like a problem of the tragedy of the commons, if you've ever heard of that, where it's because nothing's actually owned by anybody, it ends up kind of going to trash. And so this is what micro front end solves, is that kind of issue. It's not just that, it solves a bunch of other problems too, but this is one of the big ones. And so if you have micro front ends, one of the things that's important is responsibility. So basically, for instance, these are all micro front ends, and these micro front ends could be applications. They could be like your site header. They could be a calendar component, a modal with a form in it. They could be anything. And so basically you would have a team that works on it. They would have their own build and test and deploy pipeline. And then when this application is running, it will be pulling in each of these micro front ends as it needs them. So it doesn't necessarily pull them in dynamically. It depends on your implementation. So there are a bunch of different ways of doing micro front ends, but the point is that each of these little containers here are separate applications managed by different teams, or they could be the same team, but they're separate applications. And then there's a big application that is essentially combining all together, and some team does own that big one as well. And I just want to point out that it's not like each team kind of works on everything independently. There could be company-wide component libraries, right? And those are shared by specific teams as well. But again, they're owned. And so as long as everything has ownership, it makes it so you don't get into that tragedy of the commons. And then it also makes sure that you can build and deploy separately and only have to worry about your own thing. So your team is only worrying about its dependencies. You'll have your own package JSON, you'll have your own Redux store and whatever you're messing with, and then you don't have to worry about the other things. Now, there are ways of getting these micro front ends to interact with each other, but that's not what I'm going in for this. The point is, I'm just trying to explain how they work. And I even built my own micro front end renderer using React. And actually, that's how I came into contact with Module Federation, because somebody at work knew I was working on this. I'd been pushing the idea and trying to get it across that we really need this micro front end thing for that particular application. It's going to solve all our issues there. And then I was working on my own solution to make it work, and I got SSR working. And I was so thrilled. I've been working on this for a while. It was very quick to make the client-side version, but as soon as I got server-side rendering, that took another week or something. And I was so stoked about that. And then all of a sudden I find out that this concept of what I was trying to build is already part of Webpack 5. And it's already been worked on for the last 5 months. And I was really upset at first. Then I got some vindication at work, but then I tweeted Zach Jackson, and we had a big long conversation that night and went over everything. And he ran me through all of Webpack. So basically I went into the source code of Webpack with him, and we went and detailed all that stuff. And then we also went to the source code for Module Federation and how that works. And so I got a really deep understanding of this, and really seeing the future too. So I didn't just see what exists today, but what will exist in the future and what kind of needs to exist for this thing to be released to production. So this is a big thing, but It's really interesting. And it's made up of, module federation is made up of a main app and front ends. The main app is the host, and front ends, or micro front ends, I should be saying, are remotes. Now, this terminology, I haven't seen it anywhere, but we used this terminology when we were talking. So a host can, or a remote, sorry, can also be a host. And if you're a little confused by this, the host is like, if we go back a few slides, this black box here is the host. And then each of these little micro front ends would be considered a remote. But each of these micro front ends could also be maybe served on its own web page. And so it could technically be its own host with its own set of remotes, right? And even when it's pulled in here, maybe this blue box here contains other little boxes as well. And so that's the idea behind remotes can also be hosts, is that you can have remotes that have remotes. And that gets a little crazy, and you're like, why does any of this matter? But it matters because you can have micro front ends that import other micro front ends. And so along with code splitting, this can lead to much faster page load times and much smaller bundles. And also, again, it means that each set of dependencies is specific to certain teams and not to your entire project that everybody's working on. So remember that script tag example we had before? I wrote my own version of kind of what I remember from that Webpack code I saw before for module federation. And so this is what it does, is basically it runs through a bunch of stuff. It imports all of your remote libraries, like jQuery, React, whatever. And then down here, it imports it. So after assigning each of these libraries to something on window, it goes ahead and then imports your application. You're saying, that's kind of weird. So normally what happens is with any Webpack build is you'll load your application, and then it will then have all the assets it needs in that bundle. So when the bundle's loaded, it has everything it needs. And then when you do an import call, it's right there. What happens with module federation is that you're actually putting out those assets kind of like the old script tags. You're putting them out somewhere else in the cloud and then pulling them in as you need them based on what is loading right now. And then it ends up rendering your application. And now those things are on Windows. So therefore, when you do an import, it will not this kind of like function import, but when you're doing a normal import like you would normally do in your application, that code now exists as if it was there as part of the bundle, but it wasn't. It was something that was brought in after the fact. And so this is just like with the script tags. With the script tags, we loaded each of those script tags in order, right? And then they attach to window, and then it loads your application. But here you can have versioning. That's really important because now you can have different versions of the same dependencies. And even if you have a dependency already loaded, then it won't go out and fetch it again. And so that's really important as well. Code splitting also makes this a little bit more complex. So with code splitting, it's basically like your application loads, right? And then it needs to asynchronously load another chunk of a bundle. That bundle could have its own remotes and then have to go out and get them and then pull them in. So it seems like this might be slow. It seems like, wow, that's a lot of overhead and a lot of requests, but it's not, because HTTP2, which is really where I see this shining, is allows to, like, it really lowers the overhead of every single web request. And that's why it's really important from that standpoint. So this is kind of a general concept of module federation, is like each piece of your bundle could be its own separate code piece that gets pulled in. And you're wondering, like, what's the importance of that? The importance of that is because you could then dynamically stream. You could build on the fly Webpack bundles, little tiny itty-bitty bundles of Webpack, and then stream them in from edge nodes. Edge nodes are similar to a CDN, but the difference is that they're actually doing work. And you would say, well, that's like a Lambda, but Lambdas are slow. So an edge node is basically like a CDN and a Lambda combined, where you're getting the really fast data requests, but it's doing some processing to build out your bundle dynamically on the fly when you need it. So that's kind of like a future thing. It's something they're working on. It's something that I can see, like, why module federation will really take off in the future. But right now we're just looking at this piece. So we're going to look at the configuration. I say it's somewhat simple, but honestly it's not. It's like it is a simple configuration, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes. So this plugin, module federation plugin, is how you change a Webpack plugin, or sorry, a Webpack build into using module federation. So basically all of your other code doesn't change. Nothing else changes there. What changes is in the plugin section of your Webpack config, you'll just add new module federation plugin and you're done, right? Very simple, but this is actually a couple things in one, because it's both the hosts and the remotes configuration. So this might seem a little confusing, but we're going to go through each one here. So the name would be the name. If you're a remote application, it is the name that people are going to import for you. So that's why this name is important. The file name, this is the output file name. So remote entry, we're going to see this later. Remote entry is the output file name that you're going to look for. And then exposes is for basically saying you can expose like individual components, you can expose individual functions, and these are like micro frontends. So think of like, basically I made a calendar component now into a micro frontend that can be consumed by other applications or micro frontends. And so that's what this exposes is. There could be multiple in here. I just put one in here, and you can define whatever name it is, and that's the name your application is going to use. So then there are these remotes here, and this name here is going to match this name here. So this is for if you're a host, this remotes piece. So these three at the top are for if your component is loaded as a remote, and that's all in this remote entry file. This remote section is if you're a host, and if your application is a host, then these are applications that are, or micro front ends, I should say, that are available to your application, your host. So basically this name is going to come from here, and then you can rename it for your application. It doesn't have to be app one. It could be whatever it wants to be, but you can rename it to anything. And then when we get down to the shared part, I remember I talked about versioning before. These are not versioned, but we'll see that in a second here. I just want to point out that this is where you do put your dependencies that need to be shared between projects. And it's not sharing in the same way NPM does it. It's sharing in the way that you're saying, you know, I'm going to define that my application uses React 16, 13.1, and then when some other application comes in, some micro front end that needs that, it will use this version that's already been loaded. It won't go pull in its own. So yeah, this is Module Federation kind of behind the scenes. And that plugin we looked at, we're not going to look at all this, but the plugin we looked at is actually 3 other Webpack plugins behind the scenes. It's the share plugin, which is that whole share section. It's the container reference plugin, which is the host piece, and the container plugin, which is the remote. I'm just trying to show you that there's a lot going on here, and they've even handled how you manage, like if, so say you can't access a module, how does it get it? Does it get it from cache? Like, where's it coming from? Because these modules and everything is coming in separately, right? As separate tiny mini bundles, then you've got to have some way of handling those situations. So that's what that was detailing. So if we look at the shared modules, here's like an example of how you'd use it. You can essentially assign versions, and you can also do a little bit more. So here, like singleton for React, the reason that's important is because you only want one version of React. You can't have multiple until version 17 of React. You can't have multiple versions. So the singleton piece is important just for these particular packages. In general, this is probably what you need. And it could, if this looks like a package JSON file for you, it should, because basically you can take your package JSON and just pop it in here, and then all your libraries are shared with the versions that you actually care about. And you can even define this this caret and whatever that you want just like that. So then when other micro front ends are being pulled in, if they have the same dependencies, or at least the same versions of the dependencies, or the same, you know, like highest patched version of that dependency, then now you can use it this way. So there's like a lot more options here to do versioned shared dependencies than you would get with NPM. And it's a little bit crazier because it's all happening in your browser on the fly. So this example here that we were looking at, this one here, it does require node modules. I forgot to point that out. All these names are coming from node modules. There's no like URLs, right? But okay, I did out of order. You can have remotes that are being pulled in from other web services. So what's important here is that, like, before we were doing it from NPM. So the remote was named app1 remote, like this. That is something, that's the NPM name. That's the node module. If you go in that directory, this is the name you're going to look it up. But here you can also denote your app that you're pulling in from this remote entry point, which is on a different server. So now you're saying, okay, so this remote, like my component library, is being shared somewhere else, and I'm going to dynamically pull in that component library into my application without adding it to NPM. And so that changes things, right? If you want to update the version, all you got to do is, well, I guess in this case, they're not versioned, but you would just tag a different version number on this thing, depending on how they deploy it. So there's a lot of benefits there too. And I wanted to go over this library piece. I didn't show it in my original example, but the library type. So basically, this one here is common JS2. That's for Node.js. So you can define your remote as if it's supposed to be for importing in Node, or if it's meant to be imported in the browser, and that's why they have the type var here. It just creates a variable, puts it on window, and that's what this particular library line is. I don't expect you guys to know how to do this tonight if you wanted to go do it, but let's look at the docs first. The impressive docs that there are. If you go to Zach Jackson's repo of examples, and you go to the docs section, you get a nice image here. This is the image. I went ahead and pasted it in. It's very useful, right? So it's depending on your needs. This is impressive documentation. there is official documentation on the Webpack site, but the problem is it looks like there's like tons of stuff in here that you can learn, but it's pretty limited. It doesn't give you the information you're probably looking for when you're trying to build this yourself. It's more like into the core of how the source code works in the background and how like here it says container plugin and container reference plugin. Most likely you're not using those. You're going to use module federation plugin, and you don't care what's going on under the scenes. But these docs do go into that. And so it kind of explains module federation, but it doesn't really explain how you're going to use it for your situation. And the reason for that is module federation and micro frontends in general are highly situational. So it seems like, there's a use case that everybody wants. And it makes sense that, okay, so because everybody would use micro frontends, then every single use case is exactly the same. But it's not the case. For instance, if you have a component library, it would make sense that each component is a federated module. But on the other hand, if you have like the application I said before with 100 other apps, each application then could be its own federated module versus like each component. So it's a different concept depending on your needs. And so if you look at the real docs, these are, in my opinion, these are the real docs, are these examples. And these are the ones that Zach Jackson has created himself. Some of them don't work. You might have to change some code to get them to work. But if you look at the code should be mostly correct. And these, in my opinion, are the real docs right now. So because this is in beta, it's not out there publicly. Obviously, some of this is a little like crazy to look at, but he's using it in production too. So it's not like this is production ready or anything. I do run Webpack 5 on my projects, but I do not use module federation today, although it is something we've been highly considering where I work. And mainly because this is like a technology that's just going to be very foundational to changing things in the future. The main problem right now is that, yeah, like the docs, you have to go through a bunch of code examples to really understand them. So my module federation requirements. So if I was saying, okay, I need this today, what's important to me, right? My personal things that I want are no dependencies in package.json, which means you're doing a web call to pull in your dependencies. And it doesn't mean you have to go out and get them. You can cache them locally, but also having server-side rendering working, which maybe does, maybe doesn't work. I'm not really quite sure. So that, like I said, the docs are kind of all over the place, and I don't have all the information I need to really understand if that's working or not. So what I do know is that I need server-side rendering with dependency caching, meaning that basically it would load your bundle, right? And when it loads your bundle before your app even loads server-side, it would go and grab all the assets and then cache them locally. So the next time that happens, it would have them all ready to go and it would just bundle them in like normal. The difference is that now you could have something listening to like a WebSocket or a Kafka topic or anything like that. And when an update is published, it can be like, oh, okay, somebody deployed a new dependency. I will pull that dependency and cache it now so that it is ready for them when the next person comes in, instead of having to say, oh, we have to deploy, get a new server up with a new version of this dependency. You don't need that now if you have server-side rendering with dependency caching and module framework, or module federation. The important piece is that means you don't have to deploy. So module federation, even though you just heard of it today, potentially, also has competitors. There are quite a few competitors. If you've heard of something called Deno, that is a Node.js competitor. It's made by the Node.js people, the people that originally made it. And it is a competitor, not to module federation, but it is a similar idea to module federation. A competitor in the market right now is Snowpack. And this is like a Webpack competitor. They're not competing just on like some little things. They're competing like with Webpack itself. And so it kind of puts module federation into perspective. But Snowpack, behind the scenes, it's, from what I looked at in the source code, uses Rollup. If you've ever heard of that, it's another module builder like Webpack. I'm not quite sure exactly how it works from having looked at the source. And so that. I basically, on all these solutions, I have to look at the source to get the information, because even though it looks like it's got lots of docs here, it's got docs on how to use it, but it doesn't have docs on how it works. And I didn't know how it works. Does it do server-side dependency caching? How does it, handle this stuff? No freaking clue. So this might be the solution I want, but I'm not quite sure. I do have a lot of unanswered questions, and I don't quite understand this, but it is it is another way of doing it. And when you do imports with Snowpack, you would actually define the URL. So it's kind of similar. We're going to look at another example here of a competitor with module federation, and that is native JS modules that you can do in the browser today. So I tried this out. I kind of like threw a Hail Mary. I didn't even know that this code existed or could work, but I put a script tag, I put type module, and then I put an import statement, and it worked. And I was like, what? So the one difference I had to do was, so before I had this, the same URL we had before from the CDN, it doesn't work because there's no default prop being exported from this library. But I tried this thing called Skypack, and what they do is they go to npm, they take that module and they wrap it so it can be an ECMAScript module, and then all of a sudden I can use jQuery in the browser natively, and that's, to me, pretty crazy. Like I don't even know. I didn't even know this was a thing, but it's been around since 2017. So if that says anything to people, it's like, wow, I had no clue. This is a big deal because it can, like, you might not need module federation if this is good enough for your application. Kind of changes the ballgame there. So why module federation, right? After I just kind of like tore it down here, you still might want module federation because it's already built into Webpack 5, which means you have a bunch of Webpack applications. It's very, very simple to put it in, and it's compatible with like what you've got. You don't really have to change anything but putting that plugin in, and it does allow for a feature of on-request compilation, which means instead of having to do this complicated build up front, you basically deploy your code, and as it's needed, it gets compiled out and then cached. Oops. And then it also solves the problem of micro frontends. It makes it ridiculously easy to build micro frontends. And I think that's the most important reason module federation, I think, is like a really big idea, is because micro frontends are not super simple if you have to do it by yourself. But if module federation does it for you, and all you got to do is put some values in a config file on your existing projects, then that just puts it out of the way. It's like, okay, now everybody can have micro frontends with very little work on their end. So that's why I think module federation is still a big deal. And so I was going to demo, and I just want to make sure it looks like we have time. So let's take a look at my demo here. And this is actually Zach Jackson's code. I was going to write my own, and I've written my own before, but it keeps changing over time. And like I said, the docs are not there. So I just used his code. And this felt page, it doesn't work. I had to kill this example. So basically, if you look here, and we're gonna look at this button here. This button itself is a micro front end. It's coming from a different URL in app 3. And so we can go to app 3, but it's not really going to show much. This is app 3. It just loads this and has a button. So the button text here is test button. But in our application, the button's text is button. So you can change the text on the button even though it's coming in from a micro front end. So even though it's being pulled in from the cloud, it's rendering a React component, and when we can change the button text. And we just write regular React. From our code standpoint, we don't even know that this button is coming in from somewhere else. Our code looks like, oh, import button from button, and then bam, you put it on the page. It's very simple that way. So what I do want to show you, though, is what it looks like from the network tab. So if you look here, this remote entry, if you remember that from earlier in our slides, remote entry is the entry point name of the remote, and this one's coming from this particular application. So it's even acting as a remote for itself. And then these three are coming from different other applications. And so like they're hosted on different servers, and we're pulling all of these in at once when the page loads, and then we're able to do all this work on it. Now, if you look here, this says like vendors, node modules, Babel runtime. This is basically your node modules folder being pulled in dynamically as you need it. So all these little JS files are being pulled in as you need them. And if you can see here, as you see here, they're pretty small. They're like 17K, 3K, 8K. I mean, these are the sizes of these things as you're working with them. And I think I'm in development mode. So these are like the development versions of the modules. And then what was the other thing I wanted to show you? Yeah. So if you click on any of these, they're just Webpack. Like this is Webpack. So they're all Webpackified little tiny modules. And it's really cool. So here's the button right here. And if you look, there's the button component, and it looks like it's using style components, and there's nothing too crazy going on here, but basically this does not load style components, right? So this button thing doesn't load it, but it does expect that style components is loaded by something that needs it. And if it's not, it goes and pulls it itself. That code's not represented here because it's part of a different JavaScript file, but I wanted to kind of show you how that works. And then the last thing I wanted to show you is routing. This actually, you can't probably read that, but this is actually changing the URL up here. And this routing is done from a micro front end. So we're importing a micro front end from a different URL that is then able to change the routes on our current application. And to me, that's like insane, right? That's who thought this was possible? So all our application does is go up to, well, you can kind of see here. Our application goes up to /routing, but this sub application puts /foo or /bar depending on which tab we're currently on. And then what's another thing that's crazy is this bar button here is also from another micro frontend. So this is a micro frontend that loads routing that then loads another micro frontend based on the route. If that just it blows your mind, unless you're not understanding any of this, and then none of this probably makes any sense on how cool it is. Was there anything else? No. The other thing, I guess, is like using the modals and stuff. This modal is coming from a micro frontend as well. So that's, let me go back here. That's my talk on micro frontends, or not, on module federation. So do you guys have any questions? Do we have time for questions? It's a real big question. Joe.
We definitely have a few minutes if anyone's got questions. I'm still trying to process it all.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's my presentation.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry, my mic stopped. I actually did have a question for you, Kevin, and I was talking and wondering why no one was responding. Have you looked at either single SPA or System.js?
Single SPA was when I talked to Zach Jackson, he had brought it up. I don't think it doesn't take it to this level, and it's not plug and play. And System.js I've heard of as well. I've heard that in arguments against module federation, or not against it. I've heard that in arguments in favor of module federation is like System.js and the other one you noted. Those are two examples of where it's like it doesn't quite cut it for most teams. And most teams aren't using System.js. They don't want to convert everything over. Like using Webpack makes it super easy to integrate in existing projects. This is another problem with Snowpack is you pretty much have to have a separate library to then do your bundling, and you're not really quite sure how it works, and maybe it's going to work with your existing projects, maybe not. So those are kind of things to think about when you're choosing how you want to handle your federated modules.
Okay. Yeah, because those are very similar things. Cool. So no one else has any questions?
I'll ask something. I don't fully understand everything about how these things work together, but when you're bringing in like a micro front end that you said it's just a React component that you're rendering, like it's not like loading an iframe or something. It's actually just bringing in the code. So that means you essentially, for communicating with other parts of your application, the host, or even between separate micro front ends that are being loaded, separate remotes or whatever, like you just define any kind of standard API, whatever communication you would normally use, events or whatever, and that just all works as if they weren't remotes, as if they were just local components, because they are local components once they're loaded. It's just they get loaded differently.
Yeah, exactly. Now get this. So what if you have that micro front end component, and let's say you're using Redux in your application, and this micro front end also comes in wrapped in that connect function, or it's using a use dispatch, or a use what's the other one? Use selector, right? So if you have something like that, and you're saying, well, how's that going to work? Because I had Redux in this application, right? And then I created a micro front end out of it, and then I'm importing that into another one. It would work because it looks at the React context and then pulls Redux out of the context. And all of a sudden this component that worked in a different application now can work in your application and dispatch the same action. So like you were saying, yeah, with native JavaScript events, you could do that too. Or you could even just use Redux. And then when you import it, it just happens to work. And it works with React Router and all these other things because of how they interact with React's context. It's really cool. It's just crazy because they're separate applications that you're bringing in, but somehow they can hook into your stuff.
Cool.
Cool. Well, if there aren't any other questions, we are looking for speakers. This is August, and we were booked all the way up until August, which is, thank you to everyone who's presented over the year. That's a pretty incredible problem to have. Most meetups are desperate to find people, so good job, everyone. But now we are desperate to find people. So if you are interested in speaking, reach out to Joe, me, also called Joe, Max, whose name is not Joe, or hit us up on the Meetup, whatever, and let us know. We love to have speakers. We love to have new speakers and first-time speakers. All of us were a first-time speaker at one point. So let me know if you're interested. As always, you can check out the Kansas City JavaScript Slack channel. We have pretty good conversations there every once in a while. So it's a good thing to check out. And I will put this recording up on YouTube soon. So thanks, everyone. We'll see you in September.